Hi there, I'm Carl Hickman, Executive Sous Chef at One&Only Cape Town, and I'm going to be speaking to you about the Pastry Chef and Baker Challenge for the young stars. So I want to start off with the Pastry Chef, and then we'll move on to Bakers a little bit later. So for the Pastry Chef, there's two aspects this year. You're going to have to create a dessert and a butter cake. So we'll start with the dessert aspect of it. You have 3 hours to prepare your dessert. Everything has to be prepared on site. You have to use a Lancewood product, ideally one of the main items on your dessert. Some tips that I have for you is, number one, focus on the technical aspect. So whatever you're going to make, if it is going to be the main sort of component on your plate, make sure that you've tasted it, the texture is right, the flavor is right, that everything is perfect to come together. Okay, we don't want a brulee that either is slightly split or baked in the incorrect way, or you say it's a specific flavor and you can hardly taste it. Okay, so this is very important when you are creating your dessert. Number two, look at the components that you are going to use on your dessert and make sure that they go together. Make sure that the flavors go together, make sure that the textures go together. You don't want everything to be really soft and squishy or everything to be hard and crunchy. You want the different components to complement each other, and in that the flavors are very, very important as well. Something else I've written, so obviously everything has to be on white plates. You have 3 hours to prepare your dessert. Something we've seen in the past that I can just give as a little bit of a tip is try and stay away from anything that's frozen. So any ice creams, any frozen desserts, it tends to get a little bit tricky on the day. You don't have that much time. The freezer space is obviously being used by everyone, so the freezer doesn't usually reach optimum temperature. So you struggle to freeze something in 3 hours. So try and stick away from that. Also, if you're using any sauces, keep the sauces in a little ramekin or Dario mold on the side, that when we're judging, we can pour the sauce over. Generally, if the sauce gets poured over and it sits for 5–10 minutes, then it doesn't look so good. The sort of temperature drops, and it's just a little bit easier if it's on the side for us. Don't try and do too much. Okay, so if you're gonna pick a main component for your dessert, focus on that. Don't try and put 13 or 14 different components on your dessert plate. You aren't going to get extra points for adding more components. What we're judging you on at the end of the day is the overall flavor, the presentation, does it look neat and tidy, the techniques you've used, and obviously how you've incorporated Lancewood. It's important to remember that you just give us a description of your dessert and the recipe, okay, with no names or schools or anything like that on it. So that has to be there so that we can go through as well. Maybe something's a little bit confusing, we don't know quite what you tried to make, we can at least go through the recipe and just see how you've used the different ingredients and what you've put together. Okay, moving on to the butter cake. So this is quite a nice change. What we expect from you is just that, a plain butter cake. Obviously, there are different types of butter cake. You can go anything from a Victoria sponge, a pound cake, a marble loaf, red velvet. But the main item or the main ingredient, one of the main ingredients has to be butter. Generally with a butter cake, it has to be creamed, okay? It's not a sponge cake. We're not whipping up eggs and sugar for aeration. It's your butter and sugar that you would generally then cream and add some eggs, and then a raising agent, baking powder, bicarb. But it's not a sponge or an oil, so don't give us something that's light and fluffy. What we're looking for is generally butter cakes are a little bit more dense. The crumb or the texture is a little bit more crumbly. They're usually quite nice and moist, a little bit heavier. And then if you do decide to do a frosting, make sure that the frosting matches the butter cake that you've made. So if you're making a red velvet, a nice cream cheese icing obviously goes well. If you're doing a Victoria sponge, we generally just a little bit of icing sugar drizzled on top, or a glass icing, something like that. Don't let the icing overpower the cake, okay? That's not the main component. We're going to be judging you on the actual cake. I've just heard that Lopac will be sponsoring butter, so that is fantastic. It's, I mean, it's the best butter to use, the highest fat content, and that's fantastic news already. Just by using that, your product's going to come out better. And then obviously one of the criteria criteria is to use bio-wheat flour as well, which is also fantastic. It's an excellent quality product. So just keep that in mind, that you have to use bio-wheat. The cake you must bake off-site. I would suggest, if you're going to bake it the day before, that you either do it later in the evening or you freeze it immediately, because when you bring that in, I think it's at 10 o'clock the next morning, we don't want the cake to start going stale. You also obviously don't want the cake to be cold, so take it out in time. It must be at room temperature for optimal sort of eating pleasure. Okay, moving on to the bakers. So bakers, 3 styles of bread: a milk bread, a sourdough, and a whole wheat, all using bio-wheat flour. I've just written down some items to keep in mind, what we're going to be looking at for your bread, and then I'll talk a little bit about each one afterwards. So there's two aspects that we look at, or two sides that we look at: the external and the internal. So if we start with the external, we're going to look at the loaf volume. You don't want a loaf this long and this flat. We're going to be looking at how it rises. Have you proofed it enough? Was the oven the right temperature when it baked, that it gave it enough spring? So the volume of the entire loaf must be even. Okay, we're going to look at the uniformity and the shape. When you're shaping your bread, it's very important that it's uniform. So if it's going to be an oval in a banneton or a round, that you haven't got one side sort of stretching out, or it's an odd shape. So whatever shape you go for, even if it's in a tin, that it comes out nice and uniform. We're going to be looking at the crust color. So this is quite important. Test your ovens. Often the back of the oven is maybe hotter. You need to rotate your bread. We don't want one half of the bread being extremely dark and the other half being extremely light. So we're looking for an even color throughout the entire loaf. And then the crust surface. So the sides and the top, are there holes in the crust? A little bit of bubbling is acceptable. Blistering, that so often adds to a nice crunch. And then we move to the internal. So we're going to look at the crumb color when we cut it, what it looks like. So obviously this will determine or be determined by the type of bread that you're making. So a milk bread, we're either looking for a very nice white to maybe slightly yellow color from the eggs and butter, if you're enriching your milk bread. To a sourdough, that's maybe a slightly more natural stony color. Again, depending on what type of sourdough you're making. Rye, we're going more towards the browns. And then a whole wheat, generally lots of nuts or seeds, and the whole wheat flour, so a little bit darker in color. We're going to be looking at the flavor. Obviously, that's very, very important. And again, depending on the type of bread. So a milk bread is a much lighter sort of flavor. It's not too acidic, not too sour. We're not picking up too many sort of nutty flavors from it. A sourdough, we want to taste a little bit of that sourness. And then again, depending on what type of sourdough you're making, if you're making a walnut sourdough, we want to be able to taste a bit of that walnut. Or if it's a rye, we want to be able to taste the rye. And then a whole wheat, we're looking for that sort of nutty, earthy flavor to come through. Obviously, the smell is very important. So when you pick up the bread and smell it, does it smell fresh? Does it smell not too yeasty, but that typical bread smell that we're looking for? Is the aroma there? And this, obviously, if you're making your breads too far in advance, they lose a bit of that aroma as well. So try not to do that. We're going to be looking at the crumb texture. So when we cut it, what does it look like? Again, milk bread is a little bit more stable, a little bit more spongy. We want our sourdough to have nice sort of crumb texture inside, big holes, not too big. But going on to the whole wheat, we want to see when we cut it, again, you have a little bit more moisture in a whole wheat bread generally. And then onto the mouthfeel. So again, not too dry, which would indicate that it's been overbaked or maybe getting a little bit stale, and not gummy. So definitely not underbaked. So best of luck to all of you. We are looking forward to it. There is a major shortage of pastry chefs and bakers out there in South Africa. So, I mean, I love judging this section and seeing the creativity and the innovation come through from all of you guys. So we'll see you on Saturday, the 31st of October, and we're looking forward to it.